Today we explore the island nation of Cuba, a nation as exotic as it is mysterious. So what comes from Cuba? Me alegra que hayas preguntado. All those years of Spanish class finally paid off. In this video, we will learn the following and so much more. What environmental weather pattern is a huge concern in Cuba? What type of cultural expression is Cuba a world leader in? What are paladares and how have they evolved to become an important part of Cuban culture? And why are there so many vintage American cars in Havana? We'll be cruising all over to find the answers to these questions and so much more. Stay tuned to learn all about this fascinating country, starting with its geography. Cuba is an island nation that lies between the Caribbean Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean, and is about 90 miles south of Key West in the United States. In fact, there is a popular marker in Key West identifying the distance. I've seen it myself. It's actually 94 miles from Key West, but who's counting? The name Cuba comes from the native Tainos who called the island Coabana, meaning great place. And while it hasn't always been a great place to be, you can't exactly blame the geography for its problems. More on communism later in the episode. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean and the 17th largest in the world. In area comparison, it is slightly smaller than the US state of Pennsylvania. For those watching from Europe, it's a bit smaller than Bulgaria. Culturally, Cuba is considered part of Latin America due to being a multi-ethnic country whose people, culture, and customs are meshed from a number of different backgrounds. We'll dive into the groups that make up the Cubans in the people section. Cuba has a tropical climate with a dry season from November to April and a rainy season ranging from May to October. A major environmental concern for Cuba are hurricanes, a common issue for the entire Caribbean region. At the making of this video, the island has experienced 37 hurricanes since 2000, with most happening between August and October, better known as hurricane season. This is the story of the hurricane. Cuba is home to 9 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The most famous, Old Havana and its fortification system, will be explored on its own little section near the end of the video. I, for one, can't wait to share the details. Other heritage sites too juicy to pass up on include Trinidad and the Valle de los Ingenios. Designated a World Heritage Site in 1988, Trinidad was founded in 1514 by Spanish conquistador Diego Velázquez de Cuellar. 4 years later, legendary conquistador Hernán Cortés began his expedition to conquer Mexico and the Aztecs from the port of Trinidad, even spending some time in the settlement to recruit soldiers. It's also one of the best preserved cities in the Caribbean from the time when the sugar trade was the main industry in the region. The nearby Valle de los Ingenios was the origin of the Cuban sugar industry, which emerged in the 18th century. What comes from Cuba? Some really cool things. And I'm not just talking about the Cuban-themed cartoon movie Vivo. My kids love that one. The Cubans are at the forefront of dancing innovation, with more dance styles than you can shake a stick at, or spirit fingers. In terms of Cuban culture, famed Cuban-American Gloria Estefan could not have been more right. If you go there, the rhythm is going to get you. The island nation is home to danzón, the official musical genre in dance of Cuba. A slow, formal partner dance, danzón was influenced by African rhythm and European contradanza, fusing the culture of the two continents. The mambo was developed on the island of Cuba. In fact, the word mambo means conversation with the gods in Kikongo, the language spoken by Congo slaves taken to Cuba. Related to danzón, the dancing version of mambo is faster and less rigid. The cha-cha-cha was developed on the island in the 1950s and is often danced to Latin music. The dance involves quick footwork and a playful, flirtatious style. The rumba has deep African and Spanish influences. It's a playful and expressive partner dance with elements of improvisation. Son cubano originated in eastern Cuba and is considered the foundation of many other Cuban music and dance styles, including salsa. Speaking of which, salsa has its roots in various Afro-Cuban and Caribbean rhythms. While the term salsa was made in New York in the 1960s, it does incorporate elements of Cuban and Puerto Rican dance styles, among other influences. Salsa is characterized by energetic footwork, intricate partner work, and spins. When Cubans aren't dancing, they might be puffing on the world-famous Cuban cigar. While indigenous Americans have been making cigars for centuries, it was first observed by European explorers when encountering the Taino people of Cuba in 1492. Cuban cigars are made primarily from tobacco grown in the Vuelta Baja region of Cuba, and many experts believe the cigars are so flavorful, in part due to the land being rich in nutrients, particularly magnesium, calcium, and iron. Some of the most prominent Cuban cigar brands include Cohiba, Monte Cristo, Partagas, and Romeo y Julieta. Cuban rum, often referred to as ron, is famous for its history and exceptional quality. Produced in Cuba since the 16th century, it's become an important part of Cuban culture and identity. Cuba is home to several prestigious rum brands such as Havana Club, and while it's not there anymore, the internationally known brand Bacardi was founded in Cuba in 1862, before moving their operations abroad due to the Cuban Revolution because free market companies and communism don't generally mix as well as a rum and coke, or in this area of the world, a Cuba Libre. Speaking of which, Cuba is the birthplace of a number of alcoholic beverages which will be explored in the cuisine section. And before we go any farther, be sure to tap the like and subscribe button if you are interested in learning more about our global community. Tap dancing, it does not come from Cuba.
El son de Cuba traigo yo, apúrense que el son llegó.
Like most countries in Latin America, Cubans are a mixture of indigenous people, Spanish, and Africans. But within that, there are many things that make each Latin American country's people and culture unique, and Cubans are certainly a people of their own. Approximately 64% of the 11 million people that live in Cuba identify as white, 26% self-identify as mixed race, with varying degrees of backgrounds, and 9% self-identify as sub-Saharan African. Many Afro-Cubans still identify with specific African cultures such as Akan, Yoruba, Igbo, and Congo. The indigenous people of Cuba, primarily the Taino and the Cibone, have a smaller genetic influence than most other Latin American countries due to the devastating effects of European disease. Cuba has an extremely high literacy rate and also has a relatively high life expectancy compared to many other countries thanks in part to its healthcare system and social programs. Christianity is the most reported religion in Cuba, with the largest amount being Catholic, but a good number of people on the island practice folk religions such as Santeria, a religion formed in Cuba that combines the traditional Yoruba religion with Catholicism and Spiritism. Santeria is polytheistic and revolves around deities called Orisa, which are believed to be intermediaries between humans and the supreme divine force. I don't practice Santeria. Although restrictions on religion in Cuba were minimal compared to other communist nations, religious people were not allowed to join the Cuban Communist Party after the revolution due to religion being contradictory to the party's Marxist philosophy. In terms of Cubans throughout history, there are few countries in the world more synonymous with a single person as Cuba is with Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was a Cuban revolutionary and political leader who spearheaded the 1959 Cuban Revolution, toppling the Batista regime. He implemented socialist policies, clashed with the United States during the Cold War, and established a one-party state. His rule was characterized by authoritarianism, economic challenges, and controversial human rights records. Carlos Manuel de Cepedes y del Castillo played a pivotal role in the Cuban struggle for independence from Spanish colonial rule. He initiated the 10 Years' War in 1868, igniting Cuba's fight for independence and gained the title Father of the Cuban Nation. José Martí was a Cuban poet, writer, and independence activist. He is a national hero in Cuba for his role in the fight for Cuban independence from Spanish rule. His writings, including Versos Sencillos and Ismaelillo, are celebrated for their eloquence and patriotic fervor. The world-renowned song Guantanamera about a girl from Guantanamo was written by Martí as a poem before being played to music. And known as the Queen of Salsa, Celia Cruz revolutionized Latin music. Her powerful voice, vivacious personality, and extravagant style made her a beloved figure worldwide. Some of her biggest hits include La Vida es un Carnaval and Quimbara.
Sabe mi sentimiento, siente mi amor.
Cuba's earliest known human inhabitants lived on the island in the 4th millennium BC. The oldest known Cuban archaeological site, La Visa, dates from approximately 3100 BC. The indigenous Guanahatambe who lived on Cuba for centuries were eventually driven to the far west of the island by the arrival of other groups, including the Taino and the Cibone, who together were known as the Arawak. The Spanish clergyman and writer Bartolomé de las Casas estimated that the Taino population of Cuba had reached 350,000 by the end of the 15th century. Upon arriving on the island during his first voyage in 1492, Christopher Columbus mistakenly thought that Cuba was a peninsula off the Asian mainland. A visitor with deadly consequences for the natives, this led to the eventual Spanish takeover of the island. In 1511, Diego Velázquez de Cuellar set out from Hispaniola to form the first Spanish settlement in Cuba, with orders from Spain to conquer the island. And conquer they did. As you would expect, island life under Spanish rule was not a good thing for the natives, who were subdued or decimated through disease, violence, and forced labor. The local indigenous population did leave their mark on the language, with some 400 Taino terms and place names surviving to the present day. After centuries of Spanish and briefly British rule, early 19th century saw the emergence of the Cuban people striving for independence. The 10 Years' War, lasting from 1868 to 1878, was one of the first major armed conflicts in Cuba aimed at achieving independence from Spain. The war was ultimately unsuccessful, but laid the groundwork for future independence movements. The Cuban War of Independence marked the Cuban people's struggle to break free from Spanish colonial oppression. Under the leadership of figures like José Martí, Máximo Gómez, and Antonio Maceo, Cuban revolutionaries waged guerrilla warfare against Spanish forces. The explosion of the USS Maine battleship in Havana Harbor in 1898 led to the United States to intervene in the war, eventually leading to the Treaty of Paris. The treaty ended Spanish colonial rule in Cuba and transferred control to the United States, setting the stage for Cuba's eventual path to full independence in 1902. Of course, independence was a relative term. Under the Platt Amendment, Cuba gained independence but allowed the United States to intervene in pretty much any way it wanted. It was at this time that Guantanamo Bay was leased to the Americans under the Platt Amendment. More on that in a bit. The Cuban Revolution was a major event that happened in the 1950s with the goal of kicking out the government led by Fulgencio Batista. Fidel Castro was unhappy with Batista and tried to fight him in court but failed. So on July 26, 1953, Castro and 135 other revolutionaries took it to the next level and attacked the Moncada barracks. Unsuccessful, they were captured and formed the 26th of July movement while in prison. After getting amnesty, they sailed from Mexico to Cuba on the Granma yacht and fought the Cuban army in the countryside while also causing trouble in the cities. It's important to note that things weren't going well under Batista. He was quite the brutal dictator and had lucrative relationships with the American mafia, and many felt he prioritized American interests over the Cuban people. By late 1958, other groups began to support Castro's 26th of July movement, and together they finally ousted Batista on December 31, 1958. The 26th of July movement later became the Communist Party of Cuba. Cuban freedoms quickly disappeared under the Castro administration. The optimist in me would love to say that there have been positive and negative changes for Cubans since the revolution and leave it at that. But the realist in me has to report that living conditions on the island have been lacking to the point that many risked and even lost their lives trying to leave the island, a thing you don't do if all is well. With opposition ever present, Castro purged political opponents from the administration. Loyalty to Castro and the revolution became the primary criteria for all appointments. Sound familiar, America? Not all Cubans were fans of Castro and his ideology. The Escambray Rebellion was fought by a group of insurgents who opposed the Cuban government. The CIA provided some aid to the insurgents but withdrew all support after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a failed attack in which a paramilitary force of 1,400 exiled Cubans attacked the island. This Cuban victory led the rebellion to shift back to the Escambray Mountains before being suppressed in 1965. In 1962, Cuba was at the center of the most tense period of the Cold War due to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's the short version. The United States found out that the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in nearby Cuba, which led to a tense 13 days with fear of nuclear war. The crisis ended with the Soviets agreeing to take back the nukes, America agreed not to invade Cuba again, and secretly agreed to take their nuclear weapons out of Turkey. In the mid-1980s, Cuba found itself grappling with a crisis known as the Special Period, a problem that came about due to the crumbling and eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in late 1991. With the loss of Cuba's largest benefactor, trade bottomed out and led to a sharp decline in living conditions for its citizens. Over time, the Cuban economy gradually began to recover, but its impact can still be felt today.
Sin tus caderas no puedo cantar.
Cuban culinary traditions are mainly influenced by Spanish cuisine and is enriched by the diverse influences of African and other Caribbean culinary styles. Many Cuban recipes combine spices and cooking techniques inspired by Spanish, African, and Taino traditions. As with many other Latin American nations, rice and beans are a huge staple of the Cuban diet. The national dish is ropa vieja. In Spanish, it means old clothes, likely because it used to be made with food left over from other meals. Ropa vieja features shredded beef cooked in a savory tomato-based sauce with peppers and onions. Picadillo is a traditional Cuban dish that consists of ground meat, usually beef or a mixture of beef and pork, cooked with a variety of ingredients to create a flavorful and savory hash. And the Cuban sandwich, one of my favorites, is a classic and delicious sandwich that originated in Cuban communities in Florida. It's made with Cuban bread, roast pork, ham, Swiss cheese, mustard, and pickles. Cuba is home to a number of famous rum drinks, including the Cuba Libre, which translated means free Cuba. It's more or less a rum and cola with a lime and dates back to its war for independence. Named after a beach near Santiago de Cuba, the daiquiri is a simple yet elegant cocktail made with white rum, lime juice, and simple syrup. And the mojito is made with white rum, sugar, lime juice, soda water, and fresh mint. One of the most interesting ways to eat worldwide can be found at a Cuban paladares, privately owned restaurants or eateries in Cuba which are often in the home of the proprietor. They usually have a two-tiered pricing scheme, charging foreigners more so they can set a price Cubans can afford. Beginning in the mid-90s as the only non-state-owned restaurants, various regulations such as maximum capacities and those who can work in them have relaxed over time. Paladares offer the best of both worlds, offering home-cooked meals outside the home. Cuba is a communist country, and communism is a political and economic system that aims to eliminate the class system, ending the gap between the rich and the poor. Born out of the desire to replace capitalism, it doesn't sound so bad on paper, but it doesn't tend to work in real life. To create equality, communism eliminates choices, including what you can buy, where you can live, and what you can do. In the end, people are more equally poor, with little hope of ever improving their lives. Like any other ideology, communism looks a bit different from country to country, and Cuban communism has its own flavor. An example of this would be the economic reform. Though the earlier example of Cuban paladares shows Cuba is changing, it's reforming a bit slower than some of the other communist countries. The chief of state is President Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermudez, who has been in power since 2018. He took the reins from Raul Castro, who had taken over for his brother Fidel. The prime minister and the head of government is Manuel Marrero Cruz, who has had the role since 2019. The Cuban government disputes the U.S. presence at Guantanamo Bay, viewing it as an infringement on its sovereignty. The U.S. has maintained a naval base there since 1903, under a perpetual lease. The controversial Guantanamo Bay detention camp used for individuals suspected of terrorism has drawn international criticism for human rights abuses. The Cuban government has consistently called for the base's return to Cuban control, further contributing to tension between the two countries. As for the economy, similar to what has happened with the restaurant model of the paladares, the government has permitted private citizens to run bed and breakfast accommodations. Known as casas particulares, these are private homes where Cuban citizens rent out rooms to travelers, providing a unique chance for visitors to experience local hospitality and culture. Tourism in Cuba generates over 4.7 million visitors as of 2018 and is one of the main sources of revenue for the island. Unlike the U.S., Canada has maintained a relationship with Cuba, with Canadians visiting Cuba for vacations and making up a large amount of foreign visitors. The United States reestablished diplomatic relations with Cuba in 2015 in a period referred to as the Cuban Thaw. But Cuban tourism did not grow as expected, in part due to the Trump administration reimposing sanctions on the country soon after. Cuba has been attracting health tourism for over 20 years and generates around $40 million a year for the Cuban economy. Speaking of healthcare, Cuba has sent doctors abroad for financial gain since the Cold War. As of 2019, 50,000 Cuban doctors worked in 67 different countries, earning the Cuban government $11 billion annually. The largest partnership is with Venezuela, where Cuban doctors are sent in return for large amounts of oil. Of the approximately 2 million Cubans that live abroad, most live in the United States. The second largest diaspora of Cubans is Spain, who has a reported 150,000 Cubans living in its country. While there are significant Cuban American communities near major American cities around the country, the majority live in Florida, with most within Miami-Dade County. Cuban migration to the present-day United States dates back to 1778, but 1869 marked the start of one of the most significant periods of emigration from Cuba to the U.S. During this time, several cigar manufacturers moved their operations to Key West. The Cuban government had even established a grammar school in Key West to help preserve Cuban culture. The Cubans of Florida contributed to Cuba's eventual independence. Tampa area Cubans and their sympathetic neighbors donated money, equipment, and sometimes their lives to the cause of Cuba Libre. After the Cuban Revolution, many upper-class professionals and those with ties to Batista fled to the U.S. as Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union. Another wave of 125,000 immigrants came in the early 1980s due to the Mariel boat lifts. Triggered by a sharp downturn in the economy, the Cuban government announced that anyone who wanted to leave could do so. Hidden among the group, Castro cleared his prison, sending 20,000 criminals as well as mentally ill from their institutions. Immigration from Cuba since has largely been done by small groups of people who risked their lives by getting on rafts in hopes of making it to the United States or other countries. In 1994, the Balsero crisis, also known as the Cuban rafter crisis, saw upwards of 35,000 Cubans attempting to reach the U.S. by sea due to economic hardships and political discontent. It triggered the wet foot, dry foot policy, and the U.S. repatriated those intercepted at sea and allowed those reaching the U.S. soil to stay. Notable Americans with Cuban heritage include Senators Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who each ran for the Republican presidential nomination in 2016. Alejandro Mayorkas, who is of this writing the Secretary of Homeland Security, was born in Havana, though his family fled to the U.S. shortly after the Cuban Revolution. Others born in Cuba before moving to the States include actors Desi Arnaz and Andy Garcia, as well as singer Camila Cabello. A number of Americans you would not expect to be part Cuban are Cuban on their mother's side. A short list includes legendary performer Sammy Davis Jr., Cypress Hill frontman Be Real, and Olympic swimmer Ryan Lochte. There are so many other famous Cubans, but so little time. Please share your favorites in the comments. Old Havana is the historic city center of Havana. Recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Old Havana preserves a rich cultural and architectural heritage. Its narrow streets are lined with colorful colonial buildings, historic squares like Plaza de la Catedral, and landmarks such as the Morro Castle. Old Havana is a vibrant area with a mix of historical sites, museums, art galleries, and lively street life, making it a significant cultural and tourist destination. Adding to the ambiance, Havana is known for having a significant number of classical American cars from the mid-20th century, particularly from the 1950s. The reasons for this are that before the Cuban Revolution, there was a strong presence of American cars in Cuba. The revolution led to strained relations between the two countries, making it difficult to import new cars. Cubans had to maintain and repair the existing vehicles, leading to the preservation of classic American cars. It has become a defining feature of Cubans' cultural identity. And finally, baseball is a big deal in Cuba. Baseball was introduced to Cuba in the 1860s, making it one of the earliest places in Latin America to adopt the sport. Since then, it has become an important part of Cuban culture. Despite its relatively small population, Cuba has achieved significant success in the international baseball competitions. Games in the Serie Nacional often draw passionate crowds, and discussions about baseball are common in everyday life. In Parque Central along Paseo de Marti in Havana, a special event takes place every day. Baseball fans meet up to discuss and even passionately argue about baseball. At this hot corner, arguments can get intense, but it never turns into a fight. It's also a great example of the uniqueness of the Cuban culture. Beauty can be found all around the globe, and Cuba, with its historic charm and resilient people, are a great example of how uniqueness can be one of the most beautiful traits a people and a culture can have. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to learn more about our global community.